Usually, that when we think about a medical diagnosis, there's a fundamental expectation of structural precision.
Right, you expect a very clear answer.
Exactly. Like you break your arm, the x-ray lights up and shows that jagged white fissure in the bone, and the physician simply points to the fracture.
It's totally binary.
Yeah, it's binary. The bone is broken or the bone is intact. And that clarity, it provides this profound sense of comfort, really, because it gives us the illusion of total control over the physical world.
Which is incredibly reassuring. Until it isn't.
Right. Because the moment you transition from simple orthopedics into the realm of, say, neurodevelopment or generational trauma, or even bigger, the sprawling, complex architecture of global societal issues, that whole diagnostic machinery just entirely fails us.
The X-ray basically shatters.
It totally shatters. We find ourselves navigating this diagnostic landscape that is just exceptionally murky. It's a place where the lines between cause, effect, and cure are pretty much indistinguishable.
Yeah, it is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. And that inherent murkiness, that lack of a clear, targetable fracture in the human condition, that is precisely what makes systemic global change feel so paralyzing for you, for me, for the individual.
Because you can't just put a cast on it.
Exactly. When the problem is everywhere all at once, the default human response is to just assume it's unsolvable.
Which makes the document we are analyzing in today's deep dive so conceptually jarring. We are examining a text titled The Blueprint for a Peaceful World, version 1.0.
Specifically, the public academic version.
Right. And even just the title itself, Blueprint, suggests this level of architectural precision applied to something that most of us consider an impossibly abstract concept. We are so accustomed to geopolitical manifestos that propose these sweeping institutional reforms.
Oh, yeah. Economic overhauls, border realignments, all of that.
Exactly. They attempt to solve world peace from the top down, basically treating humanity as pieces on a chessboard.
And, well, the broader text of this blueprint does actually engage with those macro-level structures. It proposes comprehensive frameworks for economics and ethics and all that.
But that's not what we're talking about today.
No, it's not. Because the real brilliance of the document and our exclusive focus for this deep dive lies in its understanding that those top-down architectural models are fundamentally useless if the raw materials you use to construct them are inherently flawed.
Right. You can't build a stable house with rotting wood.
Right.
So that brings us to our highly specific mission for this deep dive. We are completely ignoring the geopolitical and economic proposals of the broader manifesto.
Totally tossing them out for today.
Yeah, we are placing our analytical focus entirely on a single, densely constructed paragraph. Just one paragraph, point 38, which is titled Evolutionary Patience and Optimism.
It's such a dense piece of text.
It really is. And the reason we're isolating this specific point for you today is that it serves as the psychological foundational code for literally everything else in the document.
Yeah, it doesn't dictate what a peaceful world looks like visually or politically.
No, it details the internal cognitive machinery required within the individual human mind to actually build it. It basically operates as a user manual for human cognition during a period of acute planetary crisis.
And right off the bat, that title, Evolutionary Patience and Optimism, it immediately establishes a very distinct philosophical framework.
It really sets the tone.
It does, because to grasp the mechanics of this blueprint, we first have to recognize that the text is aggressively dismantling our conventional understanding of optimism. It forces a complete redefinition of how we conceptualize the future.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the text is highly critical of the kind of optimism that relies on the assumption that, the arc of the moral universe naturally and inevitably bends toward justice all on its own.
Right, that passive wait-and-see approach.
Exactly. We so often treat optimism as this passive psychological safety net. It's the belief that if we simply endure the current chaos, historical progress will automatically resolve our crises for us.
And the blueprint basically categorizes that as passive optimism, which is, if you think about it, essentially a form of intellectual outsourcing.
Oh, I like that phrasing, intellectual outsourcing.
Yeah, you are outsourcing the resolution of global crises to time, to institutions, or to some vague notion of historical momentum. But instead, point 38 introduces and demands a framework of active hope.
Active hope, which it anchors in this philosophical concept called Meliorism.
Right. And Meliorism, at least as defined strictly by this text, is the conviction that the world can indeed become better, but this is the crucial part, that improvement is unconditionally tethered to and dependent upon our direct human effort.
The dependency on effort is the absolute fulcrum here. Like passive optimism is akin to sitting at an empty bus stop in freezing weather, right?
Yeah, just freezing and waiting.
Exactly. You're sitting there confident that a bus will eventually arrive because, well, a schedule exists somewhere. You are entirely dependent on some external transportation authority to rescue you from the cold.
But meliorism is a totally different beast.
It really is. Meliorism operates from the stark realization that there is no transportation authority. There is no bus.
Not at all.
Meliorism is standing at that exact same desolate stop, surveying the scattered scrap metal and discarded tires around you, and accepting that if you want to leave this place, you have to engineer and construct the vehicle yourself.
Oh, wow. That visualization perfectly captures the physical and, honestly, the psychological labor the text demands from you. Meliorism strips away the comfort of inevitability.
It takes away the safety net.
Exactly. It asserts that positive historical progression is not some law of physics. It's a human artifact. It has to be manufactured.
But, and this is where it gets tricky, the authors of this blueprint are highly attuned to human psychology.
They know how we tick.
Right. They understand that demanding this massive level of active, relentless construction from individuals who are observing a deteriorating world, well, that's a recipe for rapid psychological collapse.
Total burnout.
Exactly. Which is why they fuse meliorism with this concept of evolutionary patience. They state unequivocally that these systemic changes require vast, vast amounts of time. And I gotta say, I find a really compelling friction between those two concepts.
How so?
Well, if the text dictates meliorism, which means I have to be actively constructing this vehicle, operating with a profound sense of agency and urgency, then suddenly throwing in patience feels inherently contradictory.
Ah, I see what you mean.
Like in a world characterized by immediate existential threats, from climate tipping points to nuclear brinkmanship, patience sounds suspiciously like a justification for complacency.
Right. Sounds like sitting back and waiting.
Exactly. If I'm supposed to exercise infinite patience, where is the kinetic energy required to dismantle the systems that are causing immediate harm? Isn't evolutionary patience just contradictory to active hope?
It's a great question, and honestly, that tension is the graveyard of countless historical social movements. We chronically conflate patience with passivity and urgency with panic.
Yes, we really do.
But within the specific architecture of point 38, patience is not defined as the absence of action. It's defined as the structural resilience required to sustain action across an agonizingly long timeline.
So it's about endurance.
Exactly. Think about the specific modifier they use, evolutionary. Biological evolution does not occur in these explosive, observable bursts, right?
No, it takes millions of years.
Right. It's a slow, methodical, relentless accumulation of microscopic adaptations over epochs.
Okay, so the expectation of revolutionary speed is actually the threat to sustained progress.
Precisely.
Because if an individual adopts meliorism without evolutionary patience, they approach systemic change like it's a sprint. They attempt to build that entire bus from the scrap metal in a single weekend.
Which is impossible.
Right. They discover they've only managed to assemble a single axle, they succumb to despair, and they just abandon the project entirely. They burn out because their timeline for observable success was radically misaligned with the reality of complex systems.
You nailed it. Evolutionary patience is the mature cognitive capacity to hold two seemingly opposing realities in your mind simultaneously.
Which is incredibly hard to do.
It is. You must operate with absolute unyielding urgency regarding the microtask immediately in front of you, while simultaneously possessing infinite patience for the macro-level systemic results to materialize.
It's like applying daily pressure to a massive geological fault line.
It's a brilliant analogy.
You can't expect the tectonic plate to shift simply because you pushed on it today, but you have to continue to push with the understanding that the accumulated pressure will eventually force the shift.
Right. Urgency in the micro, infinite patience in the macro. That completely reclassifies optimism for you. It's no longer just an ambient mood or, a personality.
That becomes a rigorous daily discipline.
Exactly. But establishing that we have to actively engineer the future over a grueling multi-generational evolutionary timeline naturally provokes the question of sustainability.
Right, because how do you keep that up?
Exactly. If I understand that the tectonic plate won't shift in my lifetime, How do I maintain the kinetic energy to keep pushing every single day? How do we prevent this active hope from deteriorating into just straight-up nihilism?
And point 38 addresses this by transitioning straight from philosophy into mechanics.
Yeah,
Right.
yes. The text provides a remarkably specific mechanism to sustain this effort. It mandates the practice of cognitive restructuring.
Now, cognitive restructuring is a concept heavily utilized in clinical psychology, usually to treat cognitive distortions.
Right, like in CBT.
Exactly. But the blueprint weaponizes it for societal transformation. It boldly instructs the reader to elevate hope from an emotion into a, and this is a quote, technology for managing reality.
And that phrasing, a technology for managing reality, demands some really careful analysis.
It really does. Here's where it gets really interesting. Because in modern culture, we treat hope as an atmospheric condition.
Like the weather.
Exactly like the weather. You wake up, you read the news, and depending on the headlines, you either experience hope or you experience despair. It's something that just happens to you.
It's dictated entirely by external stimuli.
Yes. You're just passively absorbing it.
But by categorizing hope as a technology, the authors fundamentally strip it of its emotional fragility. A technology is agnostic to your feelings.
Right. It doesn't care if you're sad or happy.
Exactly. Think of a lever, a pulley, a semiconductor. These tools don't require you to be in a state of joy to function. If you engage the mechanism correctly, it performs the work.
So it's functional.
Completely. By applying cognitive restructuring, you are tasked with divorcing hope from your mood. You deploy hope as a functional instrument to manipulate the environment in front of you, regardless of the overarching geopolitical weather.
It's like a software update for the human brain. Instead of being a passive consumer of reality, this cognitive restructuring turns you into a programmer of reality.
I love that, a programmer of reality.
And to actualize this technology, the Manifesto provides a very specific cognitive framework. It instructs you, the individual, to act as if the entire fate of human evolution depends on you.
I mean, let's just pause on that. That is an astonishing psychological burden to place on a single human mind.
It really is. It seems almost deeply irresponsible at first glance.
Truly.
We exist in an era where the average person is chronically overwhelmed by just the basic logistics of survival, managing debt, navigating healthcare, maintaining employment.
Just getting through the day is hard enough.
Exactly. To then impose the directive, hey, you must carry the fate of the human species, sounds like a catalyst for a nervous breakdown.
It sounds like an impossible weight.
It does. But when you examine the utility of that specific cognitive posture, it actually operates as a profound psychological override. It terminates the passive consumption of reality.
It acts as an aggressive countermeasure against the bystander effect, but scaled up to a planetary level.
Right, the bystander effect.
Yeah, in psychological literature, the bystander effect demonstrates that as the number of witnesses to a crisis increases, the individual probability of intervention plummets.
Because everyone thinks someone else will handle it.
Exactly. Everyone assumes another witness is more qualified, more responsible, or just closer to the solution.
And we are currently paralyzed by a global bystander effect. We observe the degradation of the biosphere or the escalation of international conflicts, and the subconscious narrative is always, well, the international courts will intervene.
Or the technological innovators will engineer a solution.
Right, or the policymakers will draft legislation.
And the result of that is a species-wide paralysis where 8 billion people are literally just waiting for someone else to act.
Which is terrifying when you put it like that.
It is, but the blueprint's directive to act as if evolution depends entirely on your specific agency shatters that diffusion of responsibility.
It forces you to own it.
Exactly. If you genuinely adopt the cognitive framework that there is no one coming to save the species except you, the bystander effect completely disintegrates.
Imagine trying this as a thought experiment tomorrow morning. If you wake up, engage your cognitive restructuring, and put on that exact mindset. If the fate of evolution depends on me today, how does that change my morning routine?
It changes everything.
It really does. How does it alter the topography of your day? You walk into a staff meeting, or you navigate a conflict with a neighbor. If the foundational premise of your consciousness is that human evolution hinges on your behavior in this exact moment, you are suddenly stripped of the luxury of triviality.
You can't be petty anymore.
No. You can no longer afford the indulgence of a petty grievance, the comfort of cynicism, or the ease of passive-aggressive communication.
And paradoxically, carrying the weight of evolutionary fate does not crush the individual. It actually immunizes them against despair.
Wait, really? How so?
Well, think about where nihilism and despair come from. They're born from the conviction that one's actions are fundamentally meaningless in the vast expanse of time.
Right, the feeling that nothing you do matters.
Exactly. But when you restructure your cognition to believe that your immediate mundane actions are the vital hinge upon which the future of the species swings, you infuse the microscopic details of your life with cosmic significance.
Oh, wow. So it gives you profound purpose.
Exactly. You are utilizing the technology of hope to render reality manageable and meaningful.
But, okay, playing devil's advocate here. Holding the fate of evolution in your mind while just sitting at your kitchen table eating cereal is merely a recipe for clinical anxiety if it lacks a physical output.
Oh, absolutely. You need an outlet.
Right. If I am functioning as the sole guarantor of human progress, I need an operational mandate. I need to know what to actually do with my hands, so to speak.
And this is where point 38 delivers a really staggering pivot.
Because it doesn't instruct you to go do something massive.
Right. No, it doesn't instruct the reader to run for geopolitical office or liquidate their assets to fund global initiatives or lead some massive international coalition.
Which is what you'd expect from a manifesto on world peace.
Right. Instead, it introduces a concept it terms the fractals of peace, and the examples it provides are remarkably, almost uncomfortably, domestic.
Domestic is the perfect word for it. The text explicitly defines these fractals through three very specific microactions: an overcome irritation, a forgive an offense, and an honest conversation.
Just those three things.
Just those three. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, we really need to examine the underlying architecture of that concept. Because applying the mathematical term fractal to human behavior is highly deliberate here.
It is. Let's look at what a fractal actually is. In geometry, a fractal is a complex, non-regular pattern that exhibits self-similarity across different scales.
Like a fern leaf, right?
Exactly like a fern leaf, or the branching of human blood vessels, or the jagged edge of a coastline. The foundational geometry remains mathematically consistent regardless of how closely you zoom in or how far you pull back.
So the micro perfectly mirrors the macro.
Yes. The microstructure perfectly mirrors the macrostructure, and the Manifesto is applying the strict mathematical law to sociology.
Okay, so how does that work in practice?
It posits that a peaceful global civilization cannot be constructed from a populace that fundamentally operates on the mechanics of conflict, resentment, and illusion. You cannot build a structurally sound, load-bearing architecture out of rotting materials.
Right. The document is essentially asserting that the DNA of macro-level planetary peace is encoded entirely within micro-level interpersonal peace.
They are inextricably linked.
The structural integrity of international diplomacy is fundamentally identical to the structural integrity of how you resolve a dispute with a colleague. They are the exact same geometric pattern, just operate in different scales.
It's a beautiful way to look at it.
It is elegant, but so what does this all mean in reality? Because it invites some pretty severe logical pushback.
I'm sure it does.
Like, if we observe the sheer scale of global suffering today, we're talking systemic resource extraction, kinetic warfare, institutionalized inequality. The instruction to focus on overcoming an irritation feels deeply disproportionate.
It feels like a drop in the ocean.
Exactly. It borders on the absurd. This sounds almost too small. How does me choosing not to yell at someone in traffic actually equate to world peace? It feels completely disconnected from global conflicts. It feels akin to attempting to alter the trajectory of a Category 5 hurricane by choosing to use a paper straw.
That is the exact criticism people have.
So how does the blueprint bridge that massive divide? Because the disparity in scale seems to render the microaction completely irrelevant to the macro crisis.
That is the crucial vulnerability in most peace-building philosophies, and the brilliant part is that point 38 anticipates it.
Okay.
It doesn't just rely on the vague, optimistic assumption that, kindness ripples outward.
Thank goodness, because that's always a bit too fluffy.
Right. It provides a strict mechanistic explanation for how these fractals actually scale up, borrowing a foundational concept from physics and thermodynamics. It argues that the accumulation of these microactions prepares the societal system for a phase transition.
A phase transition. Okay, I love this part. The text uses a phase transition as the mechanism here. We all sort of know how state changes work in thermodynamics, right?
Basic high school science.
Yeah, liquid water turning to solid ice at a critical temperature threshold. But applying that to the behavioral shifts of an entire human civilization is a massive leap.
Yeah.
How does the text justify mapping thermodynamics onto human sociology?
It justifies it through the concept of latent energy and systemic temperature. Let's unpack the water analogy deeply because it's vital.
Please do.
When you begin to lower the temperature of a glass of liquid water, the kinetic energy of the individual water molecules decreases. They begin to slow down.
Okay, following you.
This microscopic behavioral change, the slowing down of the molecule, is the direct equivalent of the Manifesto's fractals.
So wait, the individual choosing to overcome an irritation is basically a sociological molecule decelerating.
Precisely. They are reducing the friction and kinetic energy of their immediate environment.
I see.
But here's the catch. As the temperature drops from 20 degrees Celsius to 10 to 5 to 2, the macroscopic appearance of the system remains completely unchanged.
Right. To the naked eye, it just looks like the exact same glass of liquid water.
Exactly. And this perfectly mirrors the moral exhaustion we experience in society.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
An individual spends years diligently practicing these fractals, right? They're forgiving offenses, engaging in brutally honest conversations, refusing to propagate hostility.
They're doing all the hard work.
And then they look at the geopolitical landscape and it appears utterly unchanged. The society is still liquid. The natural conclusion is that all their invisible labor was entirely wasted.
Because they can't see the result. Which is so empowering for you, the listener, to understand when we look at the physics of it. Because the laws of physics dictate that the labor is actually never wasted. It is stored as potential energy.
Yes. The latent heat is shifting.
The microscopic changes are continuously altering the fundamental temperature of the system. And the moment that system hits 0 degrees Celsius, the critical tipping point, this extraordinary event occurs.
It doesn't happen slowly either.
No. The system doesn't gradually become slushy over centuries. It undergoes a sudden, rapid, and total structural reorganization. The molecules lock into a crystalline grid, and the liquid water instantly undergoes a phase transition into solid ice.
The latent energy finally expresses itself structurally.
Exactly. So if we view society through this thermodynamic lens, then invisible interpersonal labor isn't futile at all. Every single honest conversation, every refused retaliation is actively lowering the societal temperature. It is drawing heat out of the system.
And we've seen this happen. History is replete with sociological phase transitions that completely baffled contemporary analysts.
Give me an example.
Consider the sudden collapse of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent dissolution of the Soviet bloc.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
Right. For decades, geopolitical experts operated under the assumption that the Cold War architecture would persist for another century. The structure appeared incredibly rigid, incredibly liquid in its stasis. Nothing seemed to be changing.
But beneath the surface, you had millions of individuals engaging in microscopic acts of cognitive restructuring.
Yes, the invisible labor.
The underground distribution of literature, the whispered, honest conversations in kitchens late at night, the subtle refusals to comply with ideological mandates, these were the fractals.
They were drawing heat out of the authoritarian system for decades.
And the geopolitical analysts were essentially just looking at the thermometer, noting that the state apparatus was still fully functional, and concluding that nothing was changing.
But the temperature was plunging.
Plunging. And when it hit the sociological equivalent of 0 degrees in 1989, the phase transition was nearly instantaneous.
The structure crystallized into a completely new reality overnight.
And the Manifesto insists that sustainable global peace functions on this exact identical mechanic, which is why it's so important that no single honest conversation or suppressed irritation is ever wasted. Even if you don't see the immediate global impact, you are lowering the temperature toward that phase transition.
Let's actually dissect the specific fractals the text demands, because they are not arbitrary examples at all.
No, they're very deliberate.
The first one is an overcome irritation. Not an overcome hatred or prejudice, but an irritation. Why do you think it tells us to intervene at such a microscopic level?
Because irritation is the genesis point of the ego's defense mechanisms.
Exactly.
Hatred is a complex, macro-level structure. Irritation is the raw, daily friction of coexistence. It is the colleague who CCs your manager on a passive-aggressive email, or the driver who cuts into your lane without a blinker.
It's the mundane stuff.
It's totally the mundane stuff. Irritation is the moment the human nervous system evaluates a stimulus and decides whether to perceive the other person as an obstacle or an enemy.
Right. And if an individual lacks the cognitive technology to intervene at the cellular level of a simple irritation, they possess zero capacity to dismantle complex systemic hatreds.
The training ground is the mundane. You have to start small.
And the second fractal, a forgiven offense, acts as the mechanical circuit breaker in the system.
A circuit breaker, I like that.
Well, think about it. Human interaction, especially in a state of conflict, typically operates on absolute kinetic reciprocity.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning, you strike me, I absorb that kinetic energy, and my psychological imperative is to strike you back to release it.
Ah, an eye for an eye.
Right. My retaliation is now morally justified by my initial injury, and that reciprocal exchange of kinetic energy can sustain itself indefinitely.
On an interpersonal level, that destroys a marriage.
Yes. And on a geopolitical level, it sustains multi-generational sectarian warfare. The violence just becomes this self-perpetuating pendulum, swinging back and forth.
So a forgiven offense is the radical act of a single node in that system, absorbing the kinetic impact and refusing to transfer the energy forward.
It's refusing to strike back.
It demands that the individual bear the weight of the injustice without utilizing it as fuel for further destruction. It literally stops the pendulum entirely.
In thermodynamic terms, forgiveness introduces a state of zero entropy into a chaotic system. It breaks the chain reaction.
Which is incredibly powerful. And then there's the third fractal, an honest conversation.
Right, which serves as the antidote to the fog of assumption that breeds conflict in the first place.
Because most human conflicts are not actually sustained by irreconcilable facts, are they? They're sustained by intersecting illusions.
Oh, absolutely. We project malicious intent onto the opposing party to justify our own defensive posture.
They did this because they hate me, kind of thinking.
Exactly. But an honest conversation, which, by the way, demands immense psychological vulnerability, cuts right through that projection. It forces both parties to align their internal perceptions with a shared, objective reality.
So when you have millions of individuals operationalizing these three fractals, they're continuously breaking conflict circuits, aligning reality, and diffusing ego defenses.
They are actively draining the kinetic heat from the human system.
Pushing us toward that phase transition. But, and this raises an important question, this naturally forces us to interrogate the destination.
What's on the other side?
Exactly. Once society hits that phase transition, once the temperature drops and we undergo this rapid crystallization, what does life actually look like on the other side?
Because human beings have a fatal tendency to conceptualize the endgame of peace as a static utopia.
We really do. We need to thoroughly analyze the distinction between utopia and protopia here, because the blueprint explicitly and aggressively rejects the fantasy of a perfect utopia.
And for good reason. The pursuit of utopia is historically one of the most lethal forces in human civilization.
It really is. The term utopia literally translates to no place. It represents an environment of static, unblemished perfection.
And the fatal flaw in utopian architecture is that it cannot tolerate the inherent friction, messiness, and variability of human nature.
People are messy.
People are very messy. If your explicit goal is absolute perfection, then any deviation, any flaw, or any dissenting individual is not merely a nuisance, they are an existential threat to the perfect world.
Which perfectly explains the historical mechanism of why utopian movements so predictably collapse into brutal authoritarianism.
They almost always do.
Because if the leaders of a movement genuinely believe they possess the blueprint for eternal human perfection, the moral mathematics become terrifyingly simple. It becomes the ends justify the means.
Right.
If eliminating a specific demographic or suppressing all free speech is the required price to unlock a flawless eternal paradise for all future generations, the utopian mind views that cruelty as a moral obligation.
The demand for purity always necessitates the mechanism of a purge. Always.
It's chilling.
It is. Protopia, however, requires a complete recalibration of expectations. The text introduces Protopia as a world that acknowledges the human condition is permanently dynamic.
There is no static endpoint.
None. There will always be new technological dilemmas, resource scarcities, and interpersonal frictions.
Protopia is simply the rigorous commitment to a trajectory. It's a society that is incrementally, observably better today than it was yesterday.
Just a little bit better.
It trades the dangerous fantasy of perfection for the grounded reality of progress. It is the difference between declaring, we will eradicate all disease and achieve biological immortality, versus, we will synthesize a marginally more effective antibiotic today.
Protopia does not require its citizens to be flawless saints.
Thank goodness.
Right. It merely requires them to be disciplined meliorists. And to secure this continuous incremental improvement across centuries, Point 38 introduces its final synthesizing concept.
Cathedral thinking.
Cathedral thinking. It means laying the foundations for future generations.
Cathedral thinking is really the operational framework for evolutionary patience. We have to look at the actual historical realities of the medieval stonemasons and architects who constructed the great European cathedrals to really get this.
Like the Duomo in Florence.
Exactly. To understand the psychological weight of this concept, you look at the Duomo. The construction of those structures often spanned 300 to 400 years.
Mind-boggling amounts of time.
The architect who meticulously drafted the initial blueprints and the laborers who excavated the earth to lay the first foundation stones operated under a condition of absolute certainty regarding their own mortality.
They knew they would never see it finished.
They knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that they would die centuries before the roof was ever placed.
The psychological discipline required for that endeavor is just staggering. Consider the Duomo in Florence, as you mentioned. When they began construction, they intentionally designed a massive space for a dome that was so large, the architectural technology to actually build it did not even exist yet.
They just left a hole in the sky.
Yes, they built the walls, leaving a gaping hole in the sky where the rain would fall in, trusting that a future generation architects who had not even been born yet would eventually invent the mathematics and the engineering required to cap the cathedral.
That requires a profound form of ego death. I mean, modern society is entirely structured around the demand for immediate, observable gratification.
We want results yesterday.
We really do. We evaluate the success of an initiative by the end of the fiscal quarter or the end of an election cycle, or at the absolute maximum, the end of our own lifespans.
Right. If we cannot personally witness the completion of the project, we deem the labor pointless.
But cathedral thinking shatters that narcissism. It is the ultimate expression of meliorism and evolutionary patience combined. It is the willingness to dedicate your finite energy to laying a foundation in the dark, possessing unwavering trust that an individual you will never meet will emerge generations later to continue the work.
And when you apply cathedral thinking to the blueprint for a peaceful world, it fundamentally right-sizes the responsibility of the individual.
It relieves an enormous amount of pressure for you, the listener. It provides this immense psychological relief.
It really does.
Because if you look at the totality of the diagnostic muddy waters we talked about at the start, the interlocking crises of ecology, economy, and conflict, the burden is paralyzing because you are attempting to calculate how you alone can finish the cathedral before you die.
Which is impossible.
But point 38 explicitly releases you from that impossible burden. You do not have to fix the entire world today. You don't have to engineer the final dome. You are not required to witness the completed structure. Your sole mandate, the entire scope of your existential responsibility, is to ensure that you lay your specific foundation stone with absolute precision today, to make sure today is slightly better than yesterday.
And how does the individual lay that stone? By operationalizing the technology of hope. By acting as if the fate of the architectural integrity depends on their effort.
By diligently practicing the fractals of peace.
Overcoming the microscopic irritations.
Acting as a kinetic circuit breaker through forgiveness.
And navigating the fog of conflict with honest conversations.
This single paragraph, point 38, is just an extraordinary, fully enclosed cognitive ecosystem. It takes the paralyzing abstract concept of world peace and distills it into a highly precise, executable algorithm for the human mind.
We begin by rejecting passive observation and adopting the rigorous blue-collar labor of Meliorism.
We temper the fire of that labor with evolutionary patience, understanding that the timeline of human development vastly exceeds our own biological clocks.
We restructure our cognition, transforming hope from a fleeting emotional response into a functional mechanical technology utilized to shape reality, anchoring ourselves against the planetary bystander effect.
We recognize that macro-level peace is mathematically impossible without the daily microscopic geometry of the fractals of peace.
We sustain our invisible labor through the thermodynamic understanding that our actions are drawing heat out of the system, relentlessly pushing the human species toward a sudden structural phase transition.
And finally, we abandon the lethal, static fantasy of Utopia, choosing instead the messy, dynamic, continuous progress of Protopia, laying our stones in the dark through the profound intergenerational trust of cathedral thinking.
It literally transforms the individual from a traumatized observer of history into an active, indispensable architect of human evolution.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought experiment to close out this deep dive. The text insists that you must act as if the entire fate of human evolution depends on your specific agency.
That's the core of it.
I want you to project forward to the very next interaction you're going to have today. It could be an email response you're drafting, a text message you're about to send, or a conversation you'll have with a family member in 10 minutes.
Just the very next one.
Imagine, operating under the rules of cathedral thinking and fractal geometry, that this single approaching interaction is not mundane. Imagine it is the foundational blueprint.
That's a heavy thought.
Imagine that whatever energetic posture you choose to adopt in this specific exchange, whether it's irritation, defensive posturing, profound honesty, or unexpected grace, is the exact template that the rest of the world's future will meticulously copy and scale up across 8 billion people.
It's all in the fractals.
If it is mathematically true that the macro structure is perfectly defined by the micro action, if your next conversation is the genetic code for the future of the human species, what kind of world are you about to engineer? You don't have to fix the entire diagnostic machine today. You only need to lay your one stone with absolute integrity. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. We'll explore the next layer soon.